respond to and thrive in our current crises. I hadn't really heard of, I've heard of the idea of trusts and community organisations, obviously, but development trust was new to me. And although Charlie's at pains to say there's a whole range of activities that comes under that title, I was particularly intrigued by the idea of a development trust, because I think that trust and development are two very important qualities to be thinking about going forward, because we're in very, very demanding times, and I think we're generally, people who are activists or intellectuals or people who are involved in society are looking for the resources that can help develop and also build trust. So I think it's a very pregnant phrase. Just to say who the hell I am a musician, writer, consultant, and activist. My relevance for today's discussion is a couple of points. I was a founding member and am a board member of Commonweal, which is a Scottish think and do tank that arose in the latter stages of the independence referendum campaign in 2013, 2014, to try to provide a kind of left-green democratic civic input, independent input into the policy discussion around about that. Before that, I'd written a book in 2004, which became a kind of sideline to my music career, called The Play Ethic, which was an investigation into sort of the relationship between creativity and technology. And maybe many of you at the moment are practicing a play ethic in lockdown. Maybe we can talk about that in a separate discussion. Parallel to that, in 2013, I've been involved with the Innovation Foundation, NESTA, National Endowment Science, Technology and Arts in London, and I helped to start off and continue to create their Festival of the Future, called Future Fest. And then finally, the Alternative UK, which is something that my partner, Indra Adna, and I co-initiated, and it began a few days after Brexit, and particularly after the murder of Joe Cox, and that was kind of our response to what looked like a very dramatic and sort of dangerous and terrifying polarisation of life on these islands, further polarisation, some might say. And the Alternative UK was inspired by and connected to Alternative Et, which was a successful, now slightly declined, but it was at the time a very successful liberal Green Party in Denmark. So we have all this conversation around about Scandinavian and social and Nordic models feeding into that, but also the slogan of the Alternative UK is, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And that's partly what we are, the problematic that we're going to explore today. So here's the structure of what we're doing. It's three parts: a brief tour of the horizon of the state we've gotten into, which is a varied state, not all bad, not all good. The next stage will be, what are the resources for hope that community and development trusts and community organisations provide for this challenging moment? And then finally, I just want a brief tour of future micro, meso and mega trends as they relate to community organisations. What are the grander challenges that you're going to be facing as you go forward? So just very quickly on the state we've gotten into, you'll recognise these maps. This strange blue and green one is actually a map of Remain and Leave votes distributed by population on these islands, not by territory. So that's why it's small and odd at the top. But certainly one of the states we've gotten into is that we're at the end point of a gathering crisis of what I call voice power and control. And you can periodize this any way you want. You could go all the way back to Thatcherism and neoliberalism as the point for your destabilization. That's another discussion. I just want to go back to this sequence of events: the crash, 2007-8, the coalition government, 2010, officially installing an austerity package, the independence referendum, 2014, the Brexit take back control referendum, 2016, Stormont collapse, 2017, get Brexit done, the election in 2019. And I just wanted to sort of find a statistic which is just extraordinary, just puts a wee bit of flesh on the bones here, which is the Hansard Society Audit for Political Engagement 2019. And in that 72% say the system of governing needs either quite a lot or a great deal of improvement. 47% feel that they have no influence at all over national decision making, and 54% say that Britain needs a strong leader who is willing to break the rules. I wonder how they're all thinking about that post that particular poll. Another one, just finally, the Edelman Trust Barometer 2009, 6 out of 10 Britons believe government doesn't listen to people like them, regardless of whether they voted leave or remain in the referendum. Now, one of the anticipated responses, and actually one of the causes for Brexit, was quite a divide between big city and small town, between strong urban and local suburban. And there was a sort of sense in which one of the responses to Brexit, may well be a kind of a move towards a certain kind of, local politics that was rejectionist, that said not in my backyard, that pushed back at change, taking back control rather than taking control to do anything particularly future-oriented. It kind of didn't work out that way. In fact, it mostly didn't work out that way. If you look at, for example, this is a slide with a poster from the May 2nd local elections, I think in England and Wales in 2019, and that's all the leaves there are independents, small I independent campaigns, which did extremely well in that particular election. Again, I'll get the statistics up. The independent candidates had the second biggest rise in selected representatives after the Liberal Democrats. The independents had 660 more than 2015. And this poster is generated by Flat Pack Democracy, which I'll talk about later on, but which is a very idealistic, soft, anarchistic way of doing parish and town council local government. But you certainly don't go in on the party political debate. You go in and you create your cause that seeks to develop the locality in as vigorous and as hands-on a way as possible. And the idealism is all in the names in these leaves. I'll read some of them out. Future Shepton, Act for Cuxton, Change for Brig End, Ideal Bradford, Democracy Bexhill. Another example of how localism doesn't necessarily just have to go to not in my backyardism or defend myself against the futurism is obviously these two Extinction Rebellion posters, one from Halifax and one from Caldertail. And Extinction Rebellion, again, is an example of how interestingly the relationship can be between place-based local concerns and a wider discussion. I mean, you could get a more global perspective than the rebelling against planetary extinction, but it's so adaptable that it can customize itself to Halifax and Corderdale. I think they've even got colliery towers there in the graphic of the Halifax Extinction Rebellion poster. Now, this is the future that many people were thinking would be the localist political consequence of Brexit. A kind of a five-star movement response. Five-star movement was the kind of network, digital-driven Italian populists that are now in power at the moment. Actually came to national governments, but started from a kind of very, very resistant politics against the establishment, the elite, La Casta, the standard politicians. There's a picture of Mr. Robinson covered in yogurt, and I don't know whether I'm going to be able to, whether you can hear this. I'll give it a try, but this is a clip that was taken from a vox pop in an area where Mr. Robinson was hoping that he would do quite well in the European elections. And there's a few sweary words here, but I'm sure you're all robust grown-ups and you can cope with it. And if you can't hear it, then I'll try and make it.
Anything about Tommy Robinson running for MEP in the region?
Yeah, he's a cunt.
And why is that?
You know why, which you won't be asking.
That's why I'm asking. Can you give me why do you think that?
He's racist, he's Islamophobic, and he's a cunt.
Can you give me an example though? Like what something he said or done that shows that he's racist or Islamophobic?
Anything that comes out of his mouth is relatively bad. You know?
You guys know anything about Tommy Robinson running for MEP in the area?
Okay,
Have you heard anything about Tommy Robinson running for MEP?
enough of that. I think that's just to show that, at least viscerally, it's a kind of refuted thesis that we are going to turn, that we necessarily post-Brexit will turn to a kind of an intolerant localism. Not so. Another narrative about this gathering crisis of voice, power, control, which is really revealed to me as I'm sort of engaging with the history of development trusts and community organisation more broadly for this presentation, is that there's been a long, deep, thrumming beat about empowerment of local communities it's been going on for a long time. It's actually evidenced in the way that a lot of the organisations that are kind of poster children for the community organisation and community trust practice have been going since, say, the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and they're enduring institutions. I mean, I have a poster there from Coin Street, which is one of the earliest, I think it's late 60s, community protests against a kind of development that was going to topple the Oxo Tower. I'll go on to talk about Inner City Trust in a wee minute, which Charlie made me aware of, but certainly in my last sort of 5-6 years of activism, there's so much has been coming through about how civil society and community energy is a real resource to solve quite big problems. The Civil Society Futures report that came out last year is very critical of complacency from existing charities about speaking on behalf of people and not allowing their own powers to come through. There's the grid image there is of the Preston model, which I'm sure you've all heard about, but that came from the Cleveland model in the US, which is about shortening supply chains and generating wealth from local activity. The Stir to Action Festival, which happens in Devon and Somerset, describes itself as a playground for the new economy. And I was delighted to hear about your own Inner City Trust, which again has been going for a long time and began, as far as the timeline says here, at a time when Derry city centre was a bombed out mass of derelict sites, has gone through the whole process of community and land trusts, of identifying what assets are to be developed and can generate both civic space and also economic activity for the community, and ending up, as far as I can see from the last time I looked at the website, quite a startling and impressive portfolio and mix of different elements: housing for commerce, generating business for local youth and adults. It's as an example of institutions that persist. And when you compare it to, say, institutions in my life, whether they're newspapers or whether they are companies or whether they're even entire business models, there's something to be said about a discussion beginning with the countercultures and beginning with radicalism in the 60s that can persist structures all the way up to the present. There's something there that's to be learned from. So there we are. The place that we're in, the state that we're in, before the great event that I'm just about to talk about, could be said to be both the best of times and the worst of times. There could be said to be a lot of slow burning promise and strengthening of communities, almost regardless, although we'll come on to talk about this, of the prevailing top-down political climate. Something of a hopeful sign. And then, so here we are, and just to kind of make the point, someone said, have you looked at Japanese tsunami pictures as compared to the coronavirus injection trajectories? Looks like the same shape, which I think is a reasonable way to sort of think about it. Some lovely quotes there from Camus, which some of you might be returning to read The Plague at this point. What do we learn in a time of pestilence? That there are more things to admire in men and women than to despise. And I hope you can hear the sirens there appropriately coming in. Once the faintest stirring of hope became possible, the dominion of plague was ended. And just that little graphic at the corner, down at the bottom there, the bottom right, is about 4 or 5 months ago, someone identified a whole range of pressing threats, some of which involved climate action failure or global governance issues, really rather large dots. And the red arrow points to a tiny, tiny, tiny little dot, and I'll read in it, called infectious disease. So the future's not ours to see. I don't think any of us who are interested in the systemic effects of climate change, climate crisis, necessarily thought it would come right to our doorsteps, right to the surface of our skins through this particular vector, but it's come. And the question is, who has the capacity and the strength to respond to it best, to help people through it best? And I'm looking at your sector and thinking you're definitely part of that answer. And again, coming back to the gathering crisis, which if it's a crisis about voice power and control, and at what level that's most effectively exercised, what does the power of local and what does the power of place-based and non-big city localities play in that? There are different stories to be forged, and I mean forged because there's going to be a real battle of stories about how the local and even the personal relates to the national, the continental, and the global. I mean, at the very least, COVID-19 urges you to make a connection between I, we, and world. So it can go just two ways. It can go. There's three ways it can go. But one way you could certainly see a story being told is protect and survive. I am terrified of this situation. We must circle wagons and identify who can and who should not be in this community. And I'm living in a perilously dangerous world. Another one might be, you could call it embrace and regenerate. I am going to look at this as a moment for reset, for me to fundamentally question the way I've been earning or the way that we've all been proceeding heedlessly through the biosphere. We might imagine completely new systems or arrangements. That little molecule in the middle is the elements of permaculture, which some of you might have heard of. But permaculture is a way to kind of live in balance, be a modern person, but also live in balance with nature. And globally, I'm interested in best practice in the world. One of the things we're finding with COVID is that when we compare ourselves against ranges of other countries, we can see different ways and pathways to deal with absolute hard crises. So we have a relationship between the I, the we, and the world, between the local and the global. But there are stories to cast in that. And we have to be self-conscious about those stories that we're part of and the stories that we want to promote, because it can go to the light or it can go to the dark. And this is just a small thing, very quickly. Demos Helsinki in 2010-11 brought out a publication anticipating sustainable lifestyles to 2050. And it's worth having a search down. I'm happy to give you the link afterwards. But it's sort of 4 examples of the diversity within which one might argue for a resilient, sustainable post-COVID economy and society. Some of it can be very, very soft and organic and local and considerate. Some of it could be saying, what's the massive technological and organizational opportunities of rearranging the world this way? Some of them might be very employment-based, some of them might be very digitally based. It's just really a picture that sort of shows how exciting not just of the usual suspects, of the planners and the strategic people like us, but people on the ground, how there are possibilities here for what looks like progress in a different direction than the direction that we've come to accept as normal. So there's the state we've gotten into, and I've sort of began to hint at the second section of this, which is really what are the resources for hope in this situation that community and development trusts, community organisations can bring. And that's a quote for those of you who have a lefty dispensation from my great hero, Raymond Williams, who also was actually one of the founding members of Plaid Cymru, which I didn't know about until the last few years ago. His great phrase, which I prefer to the old Gramscian phrase, is to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. So what possible hope can community land development trusts bring in this corona-defined era? And I think the answer is plenty. As I say, there's a historic legacy of credibility and authenticity in your sector, in the way that you've built grassroots power by creating assets for living and for working and for making a living. Again, the settlement movement, I didn't realize the history of it. We have friends who live in settlement houses in London because of it's the only way that they can practically affordably live. But that comes all the way back from Octavia Hill in the 1920s. I was also fascinated to hear about the community association movement, again, kicking off in the 60s and the 70s, focusing itself on local power rather than the power of the state. And then what does that kind of leave as a musculature, as a legacy for further developments? Well, along comes Thatcherism, and you have area-led regenerations through the 1990s, Heseltine's particular agenda. But as I read it, and as I've been reading it, development trusts are the ones that can maintain the legacy of these structural upgrades, these refurbishments, these regenerations. And I just discovered something really, really very exciting initiative called Granby 4 Streets. Again, some of you might have heard about it. It's a community land trust in Liverpool. And again, the stew that's involved here is of history and of innovation and of responding to circumstances is really, really fascinating. A lot of Spanish anarchists came to this area in Liverpool, Granby, since the 30s. It's always had a strong BAME community, very, very active and very present in the place. It was involved in acts of what they call guerrilla gardening in I think about 10 years ago, maybe longer than that, where people just decided to put plants in their streets. They weren't asking for permission, they were asking for forgiveness to greenify and beautify the area. And that was picked up by an artistic collective called Assemble, who became creative partners with the Granby 4 Streets area. And as you can see from the grid there, have provided a set of businesses, or have developed businesses with them, have developed street markets, have been involved in tree planting. For this activity, I think Granby 4 Streets has benefited, but Assemble won the Turner Prize Award, I think 3 years ago, as an example of how culture and community and enterprise and self-skilling could work together. So that's exciting. That's if we can. I don't know how much that the Granby 4 Streets is a model for people, but it feels like a really exciting thing to see from the outside. Is there a way in which a complex of elements could come together to develop localities in ways like this? Also, from reading into your sector, I have been interested in the distinction between stewardship and ownership, and I think that maps back to, again, the thing that a development or a community trust can do is to provide the physical, the built assets, the ground on and the space in which either strength to deal with the contemporary conditions is built, and also maybe possibly alternative models also generated. So this stewardship, not ownership thing is fantastic. I mean, one of the academics I read was talking about how these assets, community assets, supporting charities, social enterprises, arts practice, are about a multitude of tenures. I love that phrase, a multitude of tenures. And the ambition is, how do you structure yourself, to persist in a community? And I was looking through the DTNI website, and if I can find it on my thing here, there was an amazing list of things that the DTNI thought that it was involved in, and I'll try and sort of read them in a kind of Bob Dylan Subterranean Homestick Blues kind of way. Running the local shop post office, developing play park and recreational facilities. My machine's not working. Anyway, it goes on and on and on and on. It's an amazingly rich tableau of things that can be done under the rubric of community assets, community development, development trust. And it's looking at it just objectively, it's like, wow, all these people feel as if they're operating in the same space with the same logic, connected to each other, supporting each other. It feels like a very, very strong social phenomenon. And again, I just picked this up from Charlie making it quite clear to me that while you're talking about assets and buildings part, remember that humans are indeed the ultimate asset in this, and I think I absolutely take the point. Another resource I think that again strikes me from the outside as quite interesting is the push-pull dynamic that goes on between community organisations, assets, and national and local government. It was made very clear in a paper by a shared assets guy called Mark Walton that there certainly has been there's always traditionally been a pool element, as in the community says, we want to get these resources from you, or we want to preserve these local resources from you, local government or national government, and we will campaign to ensure that happens. But there's also a push dimension which comes from perhaps that narrative of Thatcherism, neoliberalism, where the public sector is reduced of its funding, and that public sector has to find a way to provide services and turns itself towards the non-governmental or the civil society sector. And one of the ways in which they will do that, for both for good and for ill, is to find ways to divest certain assets, whether they be built assets or services, to others out there to run them. And that can happen in a bad way, where you're just selling off property to deal with your budget deficits to the developer with the biggest check. Or you can pass it on to something like a development trust or a community trust or a land trust, which, you know, at the very least finds a way to make the asset persist in and for and with the community, that stewardship idea. I'm interested to think as to whether if that accelerates post-COVID, if that divestment strategy accelerates post-COVID. Terrible in one way, but interesting in another. Could we actually be developing what could be called a commons, or a revival of the commons? And I'll talk a wee bit about the commons later on, but at least an idea that, you know, ownership of assets in a community could be something that don't just exist, surrender themselves to the market, or exist at the benefit of the state, but can persist somewhere in between that, where the community is actively responsible for their monitoring and their development. It's a possibility that might come out of this push-pull relationship between government, localities and their assets. Okay, final section. I hope I'm doing okay for time. I'm just trying to breathlessly get through it. Is what is the future asking of CDTs and community organisations? Okay, let's move that away. There we go. So again, just to come back to the previous point, again, something I was made aware of talking to people at the DTNI, is that the future, as William Gibson would say, the future's here, it's just not evenly distributed, meaning that sometimes it's just good to get up to best practice. There's no doubt that in the Localism Act of 2011 in the UK, and in the Community Empowerment Act, but also the Land Reform Acts in Scotland, there are more tools for communities strategically thinking about their assets and their powers than there are in Northern Ireland. And I obviously support your campaign to set up a Community Rights Act. And when you get the basic tools, maybe there's obviously another chapter again of development that might be happening in Northern Ireland when you get up to speed with England, and then actually hopefully with Scotland, which has, as some of you may know, has a tougher right to set of powers for communities to express their opinions about development and their desire to see unused land brought into use. It's a big deal in Scotland, and it continues to be a big deal. So what's also interesting, what the future is going to ask of community and development trusts, is that there's a kind of an appetite for figuring out how to provide the social and technical infrastructure for local power from a number of really surprising places. Certainly from the digital and technological end, one of the consequences of the way that digital culture and internet culture has developed is that it's certainly made people think more and more about the power of sharing, of mutual and cooperative enterprise, because that's the way that the internet culture works. It's structured as a commons, or as an innovation commons, as it was once called. It's a kind of plentiful collective resource covering the planet It's very, very difficult to tie it down with copyright. It can be done, but it always slips away from that. What happened with the internet is that we were sort of almost out of nowhere, although we could talk about the history of it, but certainly it seemed as if out of nowhere something burst into the middle of our lives that was a plenitude, that was a surfeit, that was an excess of communication and information. And the people that have been most excited by that have been thinking, how can we plug our tools into localities such that those localities are more empowered, and also such that our tools start to be used and then adapt, and different uses are found for them. So here's just this is just 4 examples here. I won't go into them at all in any detail, but the open credit networks, fascinating, particularly at this moment in time. It's using software to say to communities of traders or communities of people involved in any kind of exchange, here's a way to provide yourself with credit without going to the banks, as long as you can trust each other and as long as you can behave with these networks. At the side there's a story about a New York startup that lets residents sell solar power to each other. They have solar power arrays in the top of the room. A network allows them to sell to each other at a much lower price, or just give it away, compared to Edison Con, which is the local official power provider in the neighbourhood. So they're desperately looking for trusted developmental communities in which they can try that out. Sovereign there is looking at blockchain. Blockchain is essentially a way to kind of completely identify your contribution, but also completely anonymize that contribution as well. So how will that work in terms of coming to votes locally that are very, very strong and binding about how to go in a particular direction? If you use this technology, everybody can do it with complete anonymity, but it has a lot of authority. And then self-sufficient city is the idea of a fab city, which aims to, in a circular way, produce everything, energies, commodities, food that it consumes. And Plymouth, which is one of the places that we're working, is trying to be that. But there's lots of interesting new actors that are looking for community organizations and saying, how can we empower you at the level where you are, and with some of these tools that can be, perfectly designed and effective for the way you want to go forward. Again, what the future might ask of community and development trusts. This is a sort of slightly silly witticism, but do they have the buildings for Bildung? And what does that mean? Bildung is and we picked this up from our association with Alternative, the Danish sister party of ours in the Alternative UK. Bildung was a kind of 19th, early 20th century spiritual education movement. That's basically what it was in the Scandinavian and Nordic countries. In fact, there's a book brought out called "It's the Nordic Secret to Their Story of Beauty and Freedom." And what it essentially was not just skills to turn the peasantry into an industrial workforce or a citizenry, but also psychological development. Who do you need to be? How do you need to raise your game to be ready to be a self-governing modern industrial nation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? At the very least, and actually the Bank of England's Mark Carney was actually suggesting this, we need to think about how adults can respond to accelerated paces of change. Where does that best happen? Do some of the spaces that communities and development trusts and this sector have, and also some of the services that you provide, could these be the Bildung places, the character development places for a demanding future? I think the answer to that is yes, why not? Again, how do CDTs contribute to the discussion about new politics, or which is really the obverse of saying, I'm completely disillusioned with the existing politics. I still want to be able to exert power with my fellows. How is that done? What's the language in which that's done? I mentioned Flat Plank Democracy before. I absolutely recommend that you read the Flat Plank Democracy 2.0 publication, which shows how the model has spread not just through many parts of England, but abroad as well. And again, I would just quote my colleagues at Commonweal, who again, in response to the fact that Scotland has the worst ratio between levels of local powers and size of population within those districts far too large, very, very poor subsidiarity. And so they come up with an idea called development councils, which is a shudder, sharp and take a breath, a proposal for a new system of local democracy in Scotland. But in a sense, what they're saying is, how do we revive the appetite for local democracy, but tie it to something practical, concrete and developmental, i.e. what's the community's perspective on where it wants to go with its assets, where it wants to go with its design, and how can that be something that's quite clear and has a lot of institutional authority, but which is absolutely rooted in active workers, citizens, residents, pushing to have enough powers to effect change in their neighbourhood. It's an innovative space. No one has the right model for this, but it's worth thinking into. We at the Alternative UK, we came up, or Indra basically came up with an idea of something called a Citizens Action Network, and it's a kind of a generic concept, a provocation to think, and it's shortened to the idea of a can. So the metaphor is obvious. And we've been trying to develop an appetite for this over the last couple of years since we started in 2017. But in the last 3 months, Citizens Action Networks have emerged everywhere. I mean, essentially, most notably, coming out of the COVID mutual aid movement. And there we have some various signs, people letterboxing, people using the available tools, whether they be Google or Facebook or photocopiers to print up posters, to immediately respond to need in a thoroughly horizontal way, and in a way that has actually become quite quickly, if you look at the COVID-19 mutual aid website, an enormous national platform, but built out of hundreds, thousands of local activities. It's amazingly impressive, and it's a Citizens Action Network. And just this is a wee joke factor, we think this needs a new word, and we want you to take this away and help us with this, because we realise that the word, we have institutes, which is a verb. To institute something is to introduce or establish. An institute can be a noun, an organisation with a purpose, especially one involved in science, education, or a specific profession. We can have constitute as a verb, which is to cause, to stand, to set up, to make something, to form something new. But there's no constitute as a noun. And we would like you to think about what a constitute as a noun would be. We think a constitute as a noun would be an organisation or network that, instead of having a particular purpose, aims to contain a range of forces and actors, and it uses appropriate structures to express the ambitions of those forces and actors and manifest their projects. What is that structure? Is it a really good Facebook group? Is it that plus a room that opens and is made available to people in certain ways? Is it those two things plus a 3D printer and a repair shop? Is it those three things plus a food network? But the way that structure comes about, the way that constitute comes about, feels to us operating according to new dynamics and in a very fluid way. But really, there we are. It's not quite a world first, but constitute as a noun doesn't have a definition. Maybe you can help us figure out what that a constitute as a noun would be. Coming to the end here, the other concept that again connects to the previous few slides is the way that people are talking about the building of commons or commoning as a verb. This has come again from two angles. From the environmental angle, and particularly inspired by the work of Elinor Ostrom, who's the Nobel Prize-winning economist, who won a prize for showing how commons historically work, the conditions under which they work. And what's really interesting is that a commons is a shared resource. It can be clicks as well as bricks, actively managed by communities and resting on rituals of trust and tradition. I mean, a commons and commoning is an activity as much as it is a piece of legislation, or as much as it is a legal company limited structure. And I think there's a lot of inspiration and passion to build these commons coming from the tech and green communities, and I think it's something that you're perfectly well set up to support and respond to. And again, you've probably heard this. question, will there ever be a post-COVID situation? I mean, anybody who looks at the range of pathogens that are released by, agricultural business as it currently stands would think that this is just the first of many, never mind the 10-year climate window from the IDDC. So we have specific challenges here. Supply chains need to be shortened. In the wider climate context, consumerism needs to be changed. Who starts doing that? And the green texts have a concept called cosmo-localism, which sounds just completely up itself, but actually it's really interesting. Their slogan is design global, build local. And the great example of that is, there's the post from The Alternative down in the bottom corner, where a Lochaber school in Scotland contacted the hospital. The Lochaber school had the 3D printers, and they made medical equipment, protection equipment for the hospital. The other story that backs that up is the Italian story where parts of ventilators were running low. 2 Italian students downloaded a pattern from the web and started to build the parts required to keep the ventilators going. It's a tiny little straw of what could be a different relationship between manufacturing, production, locality, digital networks and infrastructures, and the resources of the world. So the world actually allows you to operate locally, reduce your footprint, your carbon footprint, but doesn't make your life any less sophisticated or well appointed or well facilitated for all that. And just a final point, just to kind of make you laugh, I wonder if you can hear, I'm going to see if you can sort of hear this clip as well. This is a concert on, oh, it's too loud, I'm going to switch it off. Anyway, imagine hip hop music, we'll play it without the sound. This is a concert that happened a few days ago in the virtual reality video game platform space called Fortnite. Some of your kids might be playing, or maybe some of you also might be playing Fortnite. But this is a gig that happened. I'm just trying to see if I can find the musician. And it was a hip hop musician who played in this space to an audience of 15 million people, who then were able to come back and watch the gig and interact with the gig on subsequent showings. At the very least, we have to figure out if we are going to be, in and out of quarantine, in and out of the public space. If this is going to be something, certainly over the next 12 months until we get a vaccine, but possibly as a new normal, as a new way of responding to the degradation of the biosphere. We're going to have to figure out what the relationship is between the virtual and the actual, and a resilience and a community response that can move in and out of these spaces. The kids are already there with the virtual world, and I think, but we might have to start to ask them, well, how do we make this as much an area for trusted development and community development as we could have if we had access to the local space or to the local room or to the local facility. We're going to have to figure out this virtual actual life, and we're going to have to start at some point. And I think looking at some of this stuff might be interesting. How do we make a continuity between the virtual and the actual aspects of our community life? And I think that's a challenge for the big tech companies, but if this sector doesn't speak up and say, well, this is what we might need to maintain that continuity, then it will be an opportunity lost. Okay, I think this is nearly the last slide. Yeah, so putting the kind of COVID weirdness to the side, I think it's quite clear talking to this audience, and I'm really interested to hear where this comes from in you in terms of your experience. I think there's been a growing localist culture in the UK, responding to various forces, some of them top-down, some of them bottom-up, some of them dominant culture, some of them counter-culture. It does seem to be that Northern Ireland is behind, at least even on this localist development. I mean, I was told that Northern Ireland councils control only 4% of spending, and councils in Scotland and Wales control 27%. I was also shown the difference between, I think, the local trust and organisation, which some of you may know, in total is sort of spending £14 or has a budget of £14 per head in terms of the people that it deals with. It's thousands when it comes to budget per head that comes through local councils. So the flow of money is going to the places where you would expect it to go, but there are better even arrangements of the conventional consensus. But my final point would be, in this moment of multiple crises, and I think we have to say that this is a moment of multiple crises, who is it that can demonstrate to legislators, practically and powerfully, and politicians and establishments, why it is that communities should develop their own assets? Who can we trust to develop us? And I'll leave you with Travolta from Pulp Fiction asking querulously around about him, well, who indeed? All right, I think I'm done. Thank you very much, and I hope I haven't gone too much over my time, and I'm happy to hear from everybody from this point, and I will now stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Pat. In a real-time setting, you probably would hear the applause, so you'll just have to deal with the virtual applause for now. There you go.
Well, you know,
lots of food for thought there, lots of questions from me, but I suppose I just want to take the opportunity then to give the people that you had selected to respond to your presentation an opportunity to reflect on that. I did ask them something. I said that for each session that we run as an organisation, we always try to come away with a series of proposals or actions for continuing steps. I think information conversation is really, really important as part of that sort of blockchain of knowledge, if you like, and I think we're developing that here, if such a thing actually exists, and that's really important. But for us, it is like I've asked our responders to think about a question for reflection, and I'm asking the delegates that are in space with us as well to think about that as well. What should we be reflecting on going forward, and what are the solutions we need to be thinking about if we're to move forward our agenda around social change and social justice and everything else, and the other things that I've talked about. So have a think about that as well. So first up is David Mcburney. I do have a short bio, David, that I stole off the web last night, but I can't find where it is, and I can't see your face. Oh, there you are. So I can't read it out. But David works with on a voluntary basis with the Northern Ireland Open Government Network, and is presently doing some work with Community Places and DT&I, looking at a Community Rights Act and looking at planning and where community sits within planning in the north of Ireland. So it's really good to be working with them on that. So David, you had noted and previously some issues around Pat's presentation around the lack of democracy and the lack of voice and how that plays out in Northern Ireland. Do you want to just give us your initial thoughts and responses?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Pat. Excellent presentation. The emphasis on hope and the revival of the commons and the need for redistribution and system change really resonated, as did your work on democracy. I mean, the Open Government Network, we're about really pressing government for more transparency and accountability and citizen engagement. So it's a bit like some of the organisations you mentioned from Scotland. Yeah, in terms of, I suppose, questions for reflection, I'm thinking, trying to answer that question that a lot of people are asking at the minute is how we get back to normal. I would turn that around a bit and say, how can we go back to normal when normal was to a large extent the problem? Do we really want to go back to normal? Does the crisis not really provide an opportunity for radical system change? And what can we imagine now that we couldn't imagine before? There seems to be, for some of us at least, a bit of an awakening or an epiphany, to put it in very grand terms. We're starting to challenge the old common sense, or at least think differently about it, and change our conception of what might be possible. So clearly what's been revealed to me is that austerity was a political choice. It's kind of a logical scam, in the sense that we've found out that states can quite speedily and with great skill and determination, act when necessary in the common good. You know, that's been shown even by the Conservative Party. We've been shown that unskilled workers are essential. They also seem to some extent be expendable. So although for a lot of us, for most of us, they're heroes, they're also to some extent captives, because, you know, if we're being told to go back to work, or those workers, those frontline workers are being pressed to go back to work, they're kind of having to roll the dice, you know. So we've got to understand that as well, that they're kind of captive to the system. They need to work to survive, I suppose. Pat, you made reference to this, I think, to the notion of globalization and localism and the whole privatization, and if you like, marketization of public services. You know, that just has been revealed to be madness. Takes us back to your concept of the commons. You know, the privatization of public services can cause really serious ecological, economic and social problems. So I guess it's about deciding, you know, whether another world is possible, and about deciding how we can ensure that we don't go back to normal, when, as I said at the start, normal was the problem. In a sense, we have an advantage because we're a democracy. I know a lot of people are saying China can act very quickly and you know, order its population to do whatever's appropriate. But in a sense, because we're in a democracy, in theory at least, we have lots of different voices. And this goes to the point of democracy and voice. So we have different centres of power. So if those in power make wrong decisions, at least others can sort of step in and point that out and suggest alternatives. You know, that's why even in a crisis like this, democracies, in theory at least, can perform much better than dictatorships. That's why it's important to go back to the open government idea, that we have transparent and accountable government. That's why we need to see the scientific evidence that informs the government's decisions. Why we need to know what happened with care homes, for example. How were so many people left to die in care homes whenever there was all that rhetoric about protecting older people. So I think it's important from a governmental point of view, that they not continue to spin and restrict information, because if they do that, people will lose trust. And whenever the government does eventually ask everybody to go back into the world, so to speak, they'll not trust them. They'll have no confidence. I better stop and sure I'm over.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. Murdo had a comment there to you as well. He says you're on a roll.
Thanks, Murdo.
Share an office space with him. Thanks very much, David. Pat, I'm going to get you to come back and pick up on some of the points that are raised by the responders in due course if we've time to do that. But I just want to go through them. Sure. So next is Niamh Goggin. Niamh is currently a director on the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland, and Niamh has been working extensively across England this past couple of years with the big local trusts and others, and is one of our founding thinkers, driver stalwarts of microfinance. Can I say that, Niamh? Can I? Yeah. You need to unmute your mic there, Niamh, and I'll leave it up to you. That's you.
Okay, great. I have to say I'm very sorry to announce that I finished my term with Community Foundation in March. So I had a great time there, but I'm now a retired ex-trustee. So I'm going to really quickly talk about local trust and big local as an introduction into some other points. So apologies to those who've heard me say this umpteen times before. Local Trust runs the big local programme in England only, and it works in 150 areas, which you might quickly kind of characterise as Brexit voting areas, but this thing started back in 2010, and it has really been a revolutionary program in many ways, particularly because of what we're learning from it. So each of these 150 areas was given like a dowry of £1 million to spend over a period between 10 and 15 years. And the crucial point about it was that it had to be place-based and resident-led. So if you can imagine in 150 relatively deprived areas, dropping a bundle of £1 million into the sea, where it's surrounded by sharks. And so immediately you announce that, you get a whole wave of people and organizations who know exactly how that money should be spent by them. And so the money has a cage around it, which is to protect it, so that the spend is by and large driven by resident decisions. And so there's a huge range of areas. The average population is 7,500, but it goes from 1,500 people up to 15,000. And it goes from 3 ex-mining villages in the north of England to 15,000 people in Bermondsey, in the very centre of London, to Par Bay in Cornwall. So they are defined by how different they are. And I've been helping them with local economic development and social investment, and trying to be useful and supportive to help the residents achieve what they want to in their areas. I'm just going to give you 3 very quick examples. So Dover town, known only for its port, but it actually has a town which nobody ever goes into because they just drive on and off the ferries. And one of those really run down high streets with vacant shops even before COVID came along. And the big local partnership have used their money to rent on a peppercorn rent a closed down very large co-op supermarket, which they've now turned into space to rent for local businesses, local entrepreneurs. And so they have everything from somebody who repairs clothes, which we kind of stopped doing because we were all buying from pennies, right up to some kind of medium-sized, well, businesses employing maybe 5 or 10 people. The supermarket is now full, and that means that there's footfall again on the high street, and some of the people in the supermarket are now moving out to rent shops. Corby, famous for having lots of Scottish ex-miners, huge health problems, very high numbers of people on disability, people basically dying far younger than they should, and they decided to spend their money on a community health champion, kind of like social prescribing, but really based around what was available in Corby and what people needed. And that service has been so successful that now the local commissioning trust has taken it up, and they're rolling it out across the health district. And the last one is Lawrence Weston in Bristol, which was already a very developed community with a very strong network of community activity and enterprise development. And they've just gone from strength to strength with a bit of money behind them in terms of building community housing, a library, schools, solar and renewable energy programs, so all sorts of stuff. And the common factor between all of the areas is that they're sitting on a bag of money. And that totally changes the power structure in those areas, particularly at a time of austerity. So instead of being the beggars coming to the door of the council or of business development agencies or of anybody else, people are actually coming to them, which means that they've been able over time to grow into their own power and to use it to develop partnerships which actually respond to their needs and their wishes. So when I was listening to Pat's presentation, which was really interesting and I enjoyed very much, I'm not really a policy person. I'm not very good at the kind of blue skies thinking stuff. I'm an implementing person. And so I was thinking about how do you what's the step from Pat's concepts to implementation on the ground? And so I've kind of come up with 3 things that I think are helpful to implement. And the first is history. So I get really cross in the social investment world, where I work quite a bit of the time, with people who think that Sir Ronald Cohen and Big Society Capital invented social investment. I'm not going to ritter on about this, but just we have a history of hundreds of years, centuries of communal activity, people coming together to do stuff around money and finance. And obviously our own credit union movement is a really important part of that sector, or of that movement. So if we can look back as well as forward. My second one is about capital. So we quite rightly focus on human capital and social capital, but because of my work interest, my interest is in capital. And part of my focus on this came from a conversation I had with Bernadette McCalskey some years ago, where we were talking about social investment, and from her focus and interest on that, it really came home to me that what we tend to have is lack of access to capital and undercapitalized organizations. So they're doing amazing things, but they're doing amazing things in buildings which don't have the funds to be properly renovated, to be energy efficient, to have really good 5G connectivities, or to have 3D printers or whatever else. Part of that's particularly a difficulty in Northern Ireland, because we have an appalling audit-driven culture which counts beans instead of actually understanding the real potential of organisations like development trusts if they're properly capitalised. So that's a kind of a political push. We need to get people on the audit commission in Northern Ireland, and we need to start changing policy, I suppose, is really what I'm thinking about, and that's politics. And my third one then is knowledge. So this is another old song of mine. When I moved up to Belfast in the mid-80s, middle of Thatcher's revolution, and what we had was loads of people on the enterprise allowance, and they were all setting up punk bands, and they were running anarchist cafes, and they were doing all sorts of stuff. And we had a focus on money and finance and reimagining economics. Since then, we seem to have, especially during the boom, I suppose, we just that stuff's all really complicated. Only bankers understand it. They seem to know what they're doing. Oh no, they don't know what they're doing. But anyway, it's just too complicated. You know, what the hell is quantitative easing anyway? So I think we need to move back into the economic and finance sphere, and we need to understand that it's our money, goddammit. And if we're not able, we walked away from austerity. In the Labour Party on the left, we didn't say austerity is a really stupid economic idea. If you are in a situation of economic crisis, governments have to act in a counter-cyclical way, and they need to spend. So those are my three things.
Okay, I'm going to cut across you there, because I'm told
sure.
by Stevie that we're timed on this, so it will probably, the whole event will time out in 15 minutes. So look, there's 4 people to get through, so I'm going to ask you just to maybe comment as quickly as you possibly can, just so when we have a record of your thoughts and ideas, because it's important for us in terms of how it is that we move forward from this. So we'll just move quickly on then to Ian. Ian, if I can ask you just to keep your comments brief, that'd be really helpful. Thanks.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks very much, Pat, for what I thought was a really thought-provoking presentation. I mean, I think for those of us within this development trust movement, it's really important, and I think what you said helps us think about how we theorise the practice of development trust activity. I mean, I suppose what we're seeing in Scotland is an increase in interest in place, which I think is useful, and we're seeing that at community level, societal level, government level, and where I think there's some hopes of encouragement for me is how we take that discussion about place, that interest in place, and use that to begin to challenge the dominant economic paradigm, because it seems to me that at the heart of the problem is still this kind of cross-party adherence to economic growth, trickle-down economics, etc. I mean, I think what you said, I mean, if I think about the development of development trust in Scotland, it has been largely organic. I think that what's important to recognise is characterised by positivity, which I think for people in communities is quite important. So there's an energy there that we need to sort of build on and not lose. It's also characterised by creativity, sense of enterprise, etc. But as you've kind of suggested, it also fills a vacuum. Local government in Scotland does not feel very local. And when you couple that with the failures of the public sector, regeneration programmes, the private sector, and the markets, etc., I think you can see why communities have had to felt obliged to respond to try and find ways to kind of address market failure. For me, there's an issue about scale, which I think is really, really important, that a lot of the private and public sector just feels too big. We need to get back to human scale. So I'm a big sort of fan of small is beautiful. I think that what you said about democracy is really important. It's not just about size. For me, a key question is how we create the linkages or create a space where representative democracy comes together with participative democracy. So I think that's a challenge for us within that kind of democracy discussion. You touched on the tension between ownership and stewardship, which I think is really kind of important. But again, for me, part of that is how do we redefine what we mean by public ownership? It seems to me that we're stuck with a definition that was largely developed in the post-war era and based on nationalised industries and municipalism to some extent. So I'll finish by saying I think that you've rightly raised a range of challenges which society faces. I agree with you. I think that communities are part of the answer to that, that you see lots of new ideas being developed, lots of kind of creativity within communities. I suppose the question I would finish on is, how do we support and develop and fulfil that community potential, but do it in a way that doesn't place unrealistic expectations on communities and doesn't suppress the very qualities that have made development trusts so successful?
Brilliant, Ian. Thanks very much, and thanks for being concise as well. So I think we've got about 14 minutes to get through Bernadette, Johnny, and Laurie. So Bernadette, I can't see you. I don't know whether you're there or not. So I'll wait till you come back online, and I'll jump just to Johnny quickly. Johnny, if you want to come in there.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Pat. So just a few reflections just from our context in East Belfast. Your words in your presentation, Pat, around that crisis of voice, power and control is something that's resonated in the neighbourhoods that we work in that are mostly Protestant Unionist loyalist since the 70s, probably the 1950s, since the industrialisation set in. So that sort of voice, power and control crisis has kind of ran through some of our communities like letters on a stick of rock. The state that we've gotten into, I suppose from a Belfast perspective, something that we're seeing is a very corporate local council and a third sector that's full of huge structural inequalities, where locally based organisations, I think, struggle to find where some of their allies are. We have a local assembly that's incredibly populist, and while it's very accessible, isn't very transparent. We also have, hollowed out public services and a tyranny of buildings. So loads and loads of community buildings, structures, halls that aren't being used the way that they should be. In terms of, I think, some reasons for hope, certainly this COVID-19 process for us has highlighted from a community level what's important and where strengths lie. So as Northern Ireland becomes, slower, smaller, and probably even poorer in so many ways coming out of lockdown, it's showed for us locally just how responsive in neighbourhoods where things take longer and life is already incredibly complex. Local communities are so responsive and have stepped in straight away and have actually set the pace for the community sector and the statutory authorities and the wider voluntary sector to try and keep the pace with. As our society gets smaller, local groups know the parish, know their neighbourhoods very well, and as we get poorer, in poorer, more marginalised communities, perhaps we value different things. So we value things that can't be bought and sold. So those things around family ties, culture, folklore, remembrance, music, all those things which are a really strong bedrock that don't change, even though the market may do. So in terms of things to think about in terms of what the future holds, the most marginalised communities and neighbourhoods that are seen as problems to be at best fixed or at least ignored can actually be seen as the solutions for social change, certainly at a local council level. We don't have much spending at a local level compared to the UK, but currently that's what I would argue that's probably quite a good thing. Our local councils don't have a great track record in terms of addressing deprivation. So the current track record and experience in that currently lies in central government. And my final question is, how should our wider charity sector look very different to try and empower and support localism? So thanks very much.
And Johnny, thanks very much. I will say too, look, we have lots of comment coming through in the chat, and we are making note of that. We will record that. We will do a pressing of that, and we will push that back out to everybody who's registered and let you know how it is that we intend to respond to that. We have extended this by 15 minutes, so thanks, Stevie, for doing that. So we will be able to get a couple of questions in. I think there are a couple of questions sitting there. But firstly, we'll go to Bernadette. Bernadette, you need to unmute yourself there. And there you go, that's you.
That's brilliant, thank you very much. Thanks, Pat. Well worth waiting for. Absolutely, my head's buzzing at the minute. When I get off here, I'll do a bit more. To be very brief, I think some of the very key important things that are good for people to hear is that there is nothing new. Not even COVID itself, pandemics and plagues, they're not new. And the capacity of communities to be resilient, to cope, to survive, to look after the weakest, and to plan for the future have been around for hundreds and if not thousands of years. So if it was that hard to do, we wouldn't even exist. The world would have been over long ago. We're still here and it'll still be here. So all of the things I think that are important to hear, thank you for setting them out in that way. I think the core questions that we need to look at, and again you raise them, are democracy. However we describe, define it, or use the words for it, our understanding of democracy as our voices being heard and society driving government and driving everything else for the common good has been all but hollowed out. And I don't think anybody disputes that anymore. The question is what to do about it. So there are tensions around the two big models of society, one of which is kinship and comes with its benefits and its problems as to who's kin and who's not. And one is citizenship, which comes with its similar tensions and problems. It sets out theoretical equalities, but we have ended up that those don't exist. We have ended up with structures of democracy, but no real process of democracy that allows voices to be heard. A key other issue I think that comes up for us then is when we talk about ownership, stewardship, what is trust, and who owns what. And one of the things that particularly caught my interest in Dawes is when I hear as an Ulster of all these modern tools that need communities to use them I hear a conversation with a hammer asking somebody to pick it up. I don't hold conversations with hammers. So the hammer needs to be a dynamic group of active people working with communities as equal. Communities are not tools for hammers. So that conversation, that struck me on that. And going back then to pick up Niamh's point, I think you do know, Niamh, now that we have the best building in Northern Ireland. And we usedn't have anything. And we got, as a man said, to where we are today by making the money the last piece of the conversation. I've said it for 50 years and I'll say it again. Money is the last thing we need. We certainly need it, but if the conversation starts with money, we're already in the wrong conversation. The conversation starts with somebody around here would need to make this better. That would need to be me. And that would need to be you, because you also live here and it also affects you. And if the conversation doesn't start there, it doesn't belong to the community. And every time we move the conversation on, we need to ask ourselves, is the community at the heart of this conversation still in the conversation? And every time they're not, we need to stop and go and find where we lost them and why. And unless we're working on that local basis, we then find, as with Zoom, real conversations can't be held with hundreds and thousands of people. We have to have real conversations and real action at local, communal level and link them to make big organizations. You can only do that with good governance and citizenship on the one hand and real kinship and trust on the other. That's a challenge. I love it. Thank you.
Bernadette, thanks very much. Thanks very much. Well, before we let Pat sort of respond to some of the comments from the responders, I'll just finally pass over to Laurie down from Mana Trust. Laurie.
Well, thank you, everybody. And Charlie, putting me after Bernadette is not fair. Trying to gather my thoughts while actually listening to Bernadette is a challenge. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions. I think, first of all, a key issue for us, and picking up on some of Pat's points about the rise of the independents. Unfortunately, in this part of the world, independence is a very challenging thing because our politics is so bogged down in the green and the orange. Even in south of the border, very close to where I live, we have seen a rise of independents. 12% of those who sit in Dáil Éireann now are independents and have been elected because of their independence, and for many they don't like what the parties, the political parties, are saying. But that's been much more challenging here, and actually that green and the orange actually underpins quite a lot of what happens in civil society here, and we always have to navigate our way through that. And picking up on Bernadette's point about kinship and community, for many that green and the orange still outweighs issues of social need and poverty, which is so unfortunate for activists who are trying to address some of those issues. But in terms of the role of civil society here, and what COVID-19 has shown, is what it's shown, first of all, and picking up on Johnny's point, is those at the coalface, those in local communities, whether it's housing estates or rural townland, have been quick to act on behalf of their neighbours to try to make a positive contribution. They were there immediately, convening, organising, and doing, much quicker than the state could ever do, or even local government could ever do. And this has been shown. It's been shown whether it's in West or East Belfast, or rural Acklamad, or Clonbunya here in Arney. People have been acting and people have been doing. People have been reaching out to their neighbours and helping those. And that spirit of localism, of trying to make an effective contribution. And I think people are going to learn lessons from that in terms of their enjoyment of that, their enjoyment of being part of their community, of being able to make a contribution. And hopefully that's one thing that we can hold on to and continue to hold on to. But like for me, thinking to the future, what is the current crises of climate and COVID and Brexit? What do those current things mean for us in terms of the factors of production? And picking up on some of Neve's points, we've a wonderful history of embracing those, of championing where the needs are and bringing people along with us in this part of the world. The credit union movement, the enterprise movement, preschool education movement, the development of community facilities, and also community hubs, and also sports, in particular the GAA in this part of the world, across this island actually, have shown that when people convene and people join forces, they can make a bloody huge difference. But where's the next wave? What will the current crises mean for us in terms of the next wave of localism, of solution solving? And again, going back to the point, Bernadette, you made, it's really up to the people themselves to make sure that with leadership and with active leadership to take forward on the solutions regarding, and some of the solutions regarding the issues we are currently facing, maybe around poverty and food, and going back local to that tradition of growing your own and looking after your neighbours. The whole issue of community energy, and Ian, looking to the work that has taken place in Scotland, and I know that's been hit by circumstances, but that whole issue of community energy, about managing energy, reducing energy, purchasing energy, that using that collective goals of working with your neighbours to do positive things. And then finance, we've really lost our seat at the table in terms of finance. Actually, thinking back to when the European Union came to us with the peace programme, civil society was at the table. And in fact, civil society under the peace programme was really at the table and actually started bringing solutions, and their voice was at the table. That voice has been pushed out. And it's very interesting to see why and who pushed that voice out. But that voice has been pushed out. And those in activism have allowed that to happen, or actually haven't been able to stop it from happening. And we need to regain that. And unless we regain that place, then one of the factors of production, finance, the capital, which is going to be much, much more difficult to access. And I just want to leave this, the final point, and again, picking up on Bernadette, your point there is around education and community education. Activism, leadership, but we also need to help. Particularly, we've seen so many of those young people, and tying them with ICT and the opportunities for ICT, so many of those young people can really, really have and bring their talents and skills to the table. But we need to provide the platforms and the opportunities to do that. And that's really an important role for activists and those who want to create the change that we want to see and the leadership that we want to see going forward. Thank you.
Good stuff, Laurie. Thank you very much. Excellent. Well said. Thanks to David. Thanks to Niamh, to Ian, Bernadette, Johnny, and again, thanks to Laurie. We have a few questions, and I'll take the questions first. Kathleen, if you can maybe bring those forward for us. Then Pat will allow you maybe to pick up on some of the issues that our responders presented to your presentation. Kathleen, do you want to?
Yeah. So some of the questions that came through are, does the coronavirus provide an opportunity for radicalisation and system change? Do we need to generate a new community consensus around the key things covered by Pat's presentation? Will this be compromised by the political status quo? Is enhanced community planning an answer? Are there any experiments or thinking in Scotland and England about the use of the DAO technology to enable new local democratic action? And another question that came through is there a possibility of a universal basic income directly built on the great grassroots movement during the crisis?
Thank you, Kathleen. I think we had 2 questions there as well from Stevie Johnson and Marie Gaffney. I can't see what they are at the minute. Laurie, did you want to come in on something there?
Which question?
No, I thought you'd raised your hand to come in on something. That's fine. You haven't.
Okay.
Okay, great, Kathleen. Thanks for that. Pat, do you want to pick up on some of the issues that were just presented by the responders? We've got a few minutes left.
Someone said their head was buzzing. Mine's is about to explode. But yeah, just a few. I'm really struck by Naima, your point about capital. I mean, it's interesting. UBI, Universal Basic Income, is often talked about, but we almost did a universal basic capitalisation, which I think various social democratic governments, and certainly the last Corbyn government, sorry, major Freudian slip, Corbyn prospectus was trying to address that question of power and capitalisation. I'm sort of struck by, there's a phrase that the techies use, which is, okay, what's the minimum viable product here, the MVP? And what is the MVP of this sector in terms of empowerment that resists the vicissitudes of the top down? What's the bottom up minimum viable product? And I keep being, the phrase that's constantly in my mind at the moment is this old one, you've heard it a million times: ask for forgiveness, not permission. And the other phrase that often comes into my mind is a kind of friendly anarchism, or a social anarchism, or a soft anarchism. And anarchism being, what's the power structure above me that I legitimate to do stuff on my behalf because I can directly legitimate it? And, you know, technology and a range of technologies begins to allow that to happen. But also, you know, maybe thinking, the attractive thing about the Commons discussion for me is that it genuinely tries to sort of say, quite realistically to activists, you have to have a really bottom line conversation about what it is that you have to do to make your place valuable on a whole different set of indicators of value. And I think where that argument starts is probably not waiting for yet another top-down legal commission. Where it probably starts is people doing things, and to some degree until they're told to stop doing them, and then the question is, well, why should I stop doing this? I mean, that's a very, very vague thing to say, but whenever what I'm listening to all of you is that your deep appreciation of what Whitman used to call, you know, do I contain multitudes? Very well, then I contain multitudes. The multitudinous nature of people's actions these days, which was always the case, but there's a wee bit of extra juice in that with technology, and with social technology in particular, and with energy technology coming along as well. And when we talk about citizens' action networks, or constitutes as a noun rather than a verb, we're trying to think about a structure that can be somewhere between a building and a manifesto. It's being very, very metaphorical here, but somewhere between a building and a manifesto that captures the capacity of people to start things off from where they are, and in that soft anarchist sense, to keep in touch with the structures that are above them and beyond them. And I think there's lots of opportunities for prototyping and experimenting, sandboxing as they call it in the tech sector. I think Big Local proceeded from that basis. I think, as I understand it, I think it was trying to say, how do we get cash possibility to people, and where the reporting and the criteria are minimal rather than maximal. And then let's see what happens. Let's see what people do with results. It's very like the universal basic income argument, very parallel to that in terms of the way that it has a presumption about people's capacity, which is also historical. So that's the thing for me. That's the thing. That's the last challenge I would sort of give you, is what is your minimum viable product? What's the thing that you can what's the active network that you could actually persist in a way that doesn't, that in its relationship to legislation shows by it being an exemplar rather than a supplicant. How can you be an exemplar for a practice that so evidently works? Shortening supply chains in local food, consumer, suburban, domestic areas is a no-brainer. It clearly is the most resilient thing to do. But there's so much on the shelf you can draw down from, whether it's permaculture, transition towns, your own practice, conversations that can be had locally about what the best system would be if you're looking at it tabula rasa. I mean, even just that as a localization of food production, it would be would be the seedbed for other structures of genuine autonomy to kick off. And then it become, I would suggest that there's something, look at the Open Credit Network initiative that I talked about in one of the slides, and we're happy to inform you a bit more about it. But there's something about people drawing a bit of a line around something and saying, we value this in this area. I'll give you a classic example. If bioregions exist, if there's such a thing as a bioregion, which is, a relationship between, humans and nature and energy flows and resource flows, what's the right governance structure for a bioregion? And if you thought about yourself as a bioregion, what would that prioritize in terms of infrastructure? So there is so much structural, institutional innovation to come from the bottom-up local, which has been going on, as I said in my presentation, evidently for decades, and as was said before, for millennia. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Like if we weren't social animals, we wouldn't even be here. But going forward, and particularly in the face of the disordered biosphere that COVID represents, as well as Extinction Rebellion's charge and the IPCC reports on climate change, but we're living in a disordered biosphere, and it's going to come to our doorsteps more and more. But it could actually trigger a way of being together which is advanced rather than regressive. So, and I think from the stream of wisdom I've had from you this morning, I think you're manifestly capable of forging that future.
But can I just, on behalf of the board of BTNI and staff and everybody else who took the time to join with us today, just thanks, Pat, for all of your thoughts, your work, and also thanks again to our responders, David Mcburney, Niamh Goggin, Ian Cook, Bernard Michalski, Johnny Curry, who's had to leave us, and Laurie McCusker for your thoughts as well. For all of you, for your comments in the chat room and the particular questions put forward by Stevie and Maria. I hope we've partially answered those. As I said, we will be sort of progressing in this, and we'll be putting this out. I mean, our purpose in this was to just initiate a conversation around social change in the north of Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and to situate community within that conversation, and to make sure that the voice and the power of community is recognised as a force for change going forward. I mean, I do think that conversation resonates across the regions and these islands, from the south of Ireland to Scotland, Wales and England. And I'm grateful for those who take the time from those regions to join us in this conversation today. I think maybe one of the things the one takeaway that I leave with this is that there's a substantial and strong body of experience, practice and knowledge at play across these regions, across these islands. And I think it's about trying to see that, or recognise that as a blockchain of knowledge for social change, if such a thing exists, and consider ways and means in which we can connect those nodes of knowledge so that we're a much more powerful voice for change and social justice going forward. So that'll be our final comment from me. I have to apologise on behalf of John, our chair. Technology has beaten him, but I'm sure John would be extending his thanks to all of you again as well. So that's it. Thanks for taking the time. Check in with us again, and we will be sharing with you some other stuff that we'll be doing online. So brilliant. A virtual round of applause again to everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Talk to me anytime.